My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute and St. John's Abbey, I have the privilege this evening of welcoming you to our presentation and also introducing our guest speaker, Pastor Weldon Nisly. Sometimes in life, we meet someone who makes a deep impression on us simply by being who they are and for how they live their life. For me, one of those persons is Weldon. He has dedicated his life to making this world a more peaceful and a more just place. And through his work and his effort, all of us are better for that. Weldon grew up on a farm in Iowa in a conservative sectarian Mennonite culture. He received his BA in economics and political science from the University of Iowa and his master's in peace studies from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. As he neared the end of his seminary studies, Weldon traveled internationally for the first time. He went to Columbia and studied liberation theology with Mennonite and Catholic theologians and Marxist economists. Later, he began doing peace ministry while living in an intentional community in Philadelphia. It was at this point in his life when he began attending retreats in a monastery, and these retreats awakened in him contemplative yearnings and a pastoral calling. Ordained in the Mennonite Church in 1986, he served first-generation urban Mennonite congregations with strong commitments to peacemaking in both Cincinnati, where he served for 11 years, and Seattle, where he served for 19 years. Weldon recently retired from his pastorate at the Seattle Mennonite Church. Weldon has spent much of his life practicing and teaching nonviolence. He has been active in Mennonite Catholic dialogues from their very beginnings in the 1980s and co-founded the North American grassroots Mennonite Catholic dialogue called Bridgefolk, which meets regularly right here at St. John's Abbey. Weldon is a good friend of the Collegeville Institute, and as an oblate of St. John's Abbey, he calls this abbey his second spiritual home. Weldon is here on campus with his wife, Marg, who is somewhere in the audience. There she is. And they will be with us through the end of this semester. So please join me in welcoming Weldon Nisly.
Salam alaikum. That greeting you hear often in Arabic-speaking places is a recognition of God's peace. And it's comparable, of course, to our exchange of peace, the peace of Christ. Now, thanks, Carla, for that introduction, and thanks to the Collegeville Institute. It's a marvelous place for me, and I'm especially pleased as well that St. John's Abbey is also co-sponsoring this and to be in this very special chapter house this evening. And welcome and thanks to all of you for caring enough to be here. I want to introduce yet just a few people who are very special to me and here. Larry Scheffler is from Seattle Mennonite Church. I was his pastor for some years, is here visiting us this week. Carol Wise is here from the cities and the director of our Brethren Mennonite Council for Gay and Lesbian Concerns and a longtime friend, and also from the cities. And then we have other special guests from the cities. Sammy Rasuli, who will very much come up in here. Sammy's Iraqi from Najaf and is in the cities often. Just came back a couple of weeks ago, and so I'm very, very delighted because he was very important for one of our trips. And then Dr. Saif Al-Shamarti, I just met tonight, and he's visiting from Iraq as a doctor. And Kathy McKay and Steve Clemens are here. Kathy's back here, part of the Iraqi-American Reconciliation Project and sister cities from Najaf and the Twin Cities. On March 29, 2003, Shane Claiborne and, here I gotta get my, Shane Claiborne, Cliff Kindy, and I made a promise to Dr. Farouk al-Dalami in an Iraqi desert village of Rutba The doctor and 3 assistants cared for us after our car crashed in the desert in the midst of war. And he refused to let us pay for it, even though our nation was bombing their nation. And 3 days earlier, a bomb paid for with our tax dollars was dropped on their hospital. And now they were moved to a makeshift clinic, a very barren, simple clinic elsewhere in Rutba, where we were taken and where they cared for us. It was 10 days into the US-led bombing invasion of Iraq. 32 people from around the world were in Baghdad as the Iraq peace team. 8 of us had been ordered to leave and were on the way out when our taxi hit an unexploded fuse that blew out a tire. Rather than accepting money, the doctor asked that we go and tell the world about Rutba. He knew that the view of the war that you were seeing was through invading military eyes and not through the eyes of the victims of war. By early 2003, it has become clear that our president was determined to wage war in Iraq under the pretense of finding WMD or fighting terrorists. If we could not prevent the war, then some of us were called to join Iraqis and be in Baghdad with them in the war. The Christian Peacemaker Team's director at that time, who has since died, a longtime friend of ours, Gene Stolzfus, since I began ministry in the early 70s, he's been a friend and mentor. And he was the founding director of Christian Peacemaker Team. I'll refer to CPT through this as Christian Peacemaker Teams, was called. Gene called a few weeks before the war began and asked if I would join, be one of those who become part of the CPT and Iraq peace team in Baghdad when the war began. Our spiritual discernment with Marg and our 2 adult children and my congregation was brief, intense, and clarifying. In worship, on that second Sunday of Lent, March 16 in 2003, and we were in the same lectionary year as we are now, I was commissioned to go to Iraq. And a few nights earlier that week, I had awakened with a vision for celebrating communion, but dismissed it when I awoke in the morning. Mennonites celebrate communion 2 to 4 times a year and never in Lent. And so I thought, okay, that was a nice idea, but that'll never work. That morning, 2 members of Seattle Mennonite Church called me and said they had a vision that we should celebrate communion. We heard God's word, and it coincided with the lectionary gospel from Mark 8. Jesus' call to take up the cross and follow, and the paradox of saving life in order to have, losing life in order to save life. God gave me this word in my homily that led into the Eucharist that Sunday, 2 days before I left. In the shadow of September 11, Americans desperately want to erase our vulnerability. Jesus tells us that erasing our vulnerability is an impossible illusion. Vulnerability is the demonstrated way of Jesus. What does the Eucharist mean if it isn't to teach us how to live Jesus' nonviolent way of vulnerability? Our worship at word and table led us to trust God and relinquish fear beyond imagination. Stanley Hauerwas reminds us that worship is a political act, and the Eucharist is the witness necessary for the world to know that there is an alternative to the sacrifice of war. After celebrating the Eucharist, everyone who could write their name, down to our youngest children, signed their names on these special papers, and I carried them with me for 3 weeks in Iraq. The body of Christ, as Seattle Mennonite Church, went to Iraq in the war. I happened to be the physical body sent. As our CPT members arrived in Amman, Jordan to go into Iraq, we were hoping to be there before the bombing began, and as we arrived, the bombing began and the war started. So in the trauma of those first stages of the war, it took us several days to get visas, and a miracle from the Iraqi embassy in Jordan, in Amman. On the way in, these are just some of the pictures. Most of the bridges there were very few vehicles. Most of the bridges had already been bombed. There were lots of fires and a number of stories on the way in. I don't have time to tell you. We arrived at our little Aldar hotel in central Baghdad. We were stationed in 2 hotels nearby there near the Tigris River and across the river from all the government complexes that had already been heavily bombed there in the center of Baghdad. A severe windstorm. It was late afternoon, and as we arrived, a severe sandstorm, a desert sandstorm, swept through Baghdad. I tried getting pictures of it, but I wouldn't come up on my camera. This one I found that fall in the National Geographic. A photojournalist had taken this one. The whole early evening had turned into an eerie blood red, just like this. And I wrote in my journal that night, God is weeping tears of blood over Baghdad. In central Baghdad, our 32-member Iraq peace team worked with Zaid, an Iraqi man, to document bombings and civilian injuries and so on that were happening, all the things we knew you weren't seeing. And then we were trying, in the trauma of war, trying to get out as many stories everywhere we could. And a lot of the international journalists were talking to us and getting their stories from us. So this is the one day we went to, I'll just show you 2. Then we went to a bombing of a public marketplace that had happened the previous day. And as is typical in Iraq, in these marketplaces, there are shops on the first floor and then people live above them. In this marketplace, a pregnant woman had died the day before and several others that we had documented. We documented the bombing of a family home next to a children's school. An anti-personnel bomb exploded here the previous night, and an anti-personnel bomb explodes a few feet above the surface, releasing hundreds of tiny, dense, depleted uranium pellets meant to shred human flesh. And here, this father in this second floor room of that house, this is the blood that he had lost from this bomb that had gone off and shredded his flesh. He was not killed, he was in the hospital at this time. And then looking from that floor, then across to the schoolyard, all the windows in the school had been blown out and there was shrapnel all across the schoolyard. Early one morning, a horrendous bomb exploded a few blocks away. The closest yet, there are no words to describe this, but my body knew instantly that it was very close. So several of us investigated the location, and then we're going back to, we had our morning briefing. Every morning we met for prayer and sort of planning the day and who would go where and how we would do it. And then at night we would debrief, what did we see, what did we hear, how did we get the stories out, and how are you doing? And just checking in with each other. And so on. So several of us went to investigate this one, and as we left to go back to meet the others that morning, Baghdad police saw us and began asking questions, and then took us to a police station across Baghdad. And they never arrested us or threatened us or harmed us in any way, but they also wouldn't release us, and we went through a long series of questions, and finally were sent out of the country, leaving the next morning. And so the next morning, in the bright sunshine of another surreal day of war, we were driving at a very high rate of speed. In these places you drive, one of the hardest things for me is how fast you drive. Anywhere from 90 to 110 very often is not unusual, and we were driving that fast, and nothing else was on the road except we'd see bombers overhead. And suddenly there was a loud explosion, a tire blew out and the car careened over an embankment and off on the right side, and we were injured and we got ourselves out of the car. Another Iraqi vehicle was going the other direction, and the guy stopped and picked us up and took us directly to this Rutba clinic where we were cared for then. And then the other vehicle that was with us had gone on ahead. We were supposed to keep each other in sight. For some reason, they were too far ahead and didn't see what happened. Finally, waited for us, and we didn't come, and came back. And Rutba was the only place you could go to, and began looking and found us at this place. By then, it was getting into the evening. And it was still daylight, but it was getting late. And so I consulted with the doctor and decided that I was injured worst and that I really needed to be at least in the Red Cross hospital, just into Jordan, or in a hospital in Amman. And so we got everybody into one car and set off for the hospital. Then and a Jordanian doctor, I passed out at the Jordanian border, and a Jordanian doctor in an ambulance came and got me and took me through the night. 16 hours after the accident, the next morning I was at the Arab Medical Center in Amman and very well cared for as well. My primary nurse, Hisham, cared for me with quiet, competent compassion. Barely said a word, but very, very, very caring. When I was discharged, he came and sat on the bed, kind of in an unusual way, and just as I gathered the few things I had, and then I knew he wanted to say something, and finally he asked, can I talk to you? And so I just stopped and I said, yes, Hisham, what would you like to talk about? He said, are you going back to Baghdad or to America? And I explained that for now I needed to go back to Seattle, to my family, and to heal, and to my congregation, and hopefully return when possible. And then he asked me, will you take a message back to America for us? And I said, sure, Hisham, what would you like me to say at home? And he said so quietly and clearly, he said, tell Americans we love Americans. And then he hesitated, and then firmly but without malice said, but we hate American aggression. For nearly 7 years, I've told that story for the next 7 years, as the others who were involved had, but for nearly 7 years I longed to return to Rutba to thank the doctors and all who cared for us. Finally, 8 of us went to Rutba in peace in January 2010. Actually, I arrived here, was here at the Collegeville Institute 1 week, and then spent the rest of January in Iraq. Our return was made possible by Sami Rasuli, who was our Iraqi guide, leader, interpreter, and had the connections in Rutba and so on. So Sami, I'm very grateful you're here tonight. It's just so good to see you. Sami was also the founder director of the Muslim Peace Team. Again, a miracle produced visas. Our last hope in Amman was meeting with the Iraqi ambassador. And so we finally got to meet the ambassador. Sami introduced us and explained, we are connecting people to begin repairing relationships between American and Iraqi people. When people meet each other and look each other in the eye, they find they are sisters and brothers. Do any of you remember Father John's sermon on Sunday and the story he told? I thought he might be here because I wanted to, about when you see, when it's light enough to see, as you look in the eye of your sister or brother and see them as a sister or brother. The ambassador listened to our plea to return to Rutba and explained why he couldn't grant visas to Americans in Jordan going to Iraq. And my heart sank. And then he added, but your mission is a noble one, and I will grant you a special visa to go to Rutba. He made a call, and we got a visa, and we set out for Rutba. Arriving at the Rutba hospital, we told the story of our last visit to Rutba and our mission of peace and gratitude. And they told us we were the last ones there, disarmed and in peace, 7 years earlier, and the first ones to return disarmed and in peace, 7 years into the war. We were welcomed by Dr. Nizer Jamal Yassin and Rutba's mayor. This young doctor was the head of the hospital there, and Rutba's mayor, Cosimo Marai, who the city hall was directly across the street from the hospital. So we're in the middle of Rutba. And they both insisted that we are their official guests. We would stay at the hospital guest house, and that our meals and our lodging and everything, they would take care of that. So they provided all of that for us. The next morning, the mayor invited us over to his office to welcome us officially to Rutba. This is the group. The guy on the left was one of the security leaders of Rutba. The next one is Dr. Nizer, and then Sammy, of course, Shane Claiborne, the mayor, and then me and Peggy Gish, and Cliff Kindy is kneeling at the front in the middle, and then Logan Malaturi was the other member of our group. Logan was an American Army soldier in Iraq who left as a conscientious objector and wanted to go back in peace and went back with us. Has become a good friend. He's written 2 books about this too. The next morning, Tariq Ali Marzouk walked unannounced into the lounge where we were there at the hospital and greeted us with a big smile. Tariq was the nurse who, with Dr. Farouk, was assisting that day and helped sewing up heads and so on in 2003. And we were sharing memories with Tariq when another man walked in, Jazim Muhammad Jamil, the doctor's medical assistant that day. So the 3 of them were really taking care of us. And so on. I will always remember they were telling us about, Cliff had he was bleeding to death. He had a terrible, terrible cut on the top of his head. I had cuts on the back of my head and had a broken thumb and shoulder and broken sternum and ribs and so on. But so I didn't even know I was cut. And Jazim sewed up my head. I will always know, it took me a little while to realize what was happening. I know the sound and feel of getting stitches in your scalp without anesthesia, because they had none due to 12 years of U.S. sanctions in Iraq. There was almost no medication there. But they would have done anything to help us. Oh, and when Jazim came in, I jumped up, reached out to shake his hand. He said, "No, I give you an Iraqi greeting," and gave me a big bear hug. The flyer that went out was somebody else taking that picture of Jazim giving me that greeting and welcome to Iraq. And he exclaimed, "When I heard you had returned to Rupa, I thought you must have forgotten something. I couldn't believe you came back to thank us." Dr. Farouk Al-Dalami left Rupa Hospital in 2004 and was up in Ramadi at a big hospital near Baghdad in Ramadi. And he was unable to come to Rupa to meet us, and we were unable to go there. So we never did get to see him. We were very sorry, but we'll be forever grateful for his compassion and care for us. Later, we were in the guest lounge again, chatting with Iraqis who were always coming. They were taking us someplace, or others would come and see us, and so on. When we were just chatting there, when I was sitting on the chair sort of off in the right corner of the room from the door, and we were in a circle around the room, and suddenly this older Iraqi gentleman walked in and looked around the room, and a strange sensation filled my body. My body was telling me, I know who this is, and my mind was saying, I have no idea who this is. And then as he began speaking, and Sammy was translating, and he looked around the room, and he looked at Cliff, and he said, I remember you. And then he looked at Shane, and he said, I remember you. And then he saw me in the corner, he said, I remember you. And then he added, and I carried you. And so it took me several seconds, as Sammy was explaining, for me to realize what he was saying and who he was. Sayadi Michel Rashid was the Rutba ambulance driver who was also there at the clinic on March 29, 2003, and he explained, I saw you badly injured when they brought you in the car, and so I picked you up and carried you in and laid you on the bed. I had never told that story because I hadn't remembered. When Sayadi entered the room, my body remembered before my mind did. The Eucharist feeds us for body memory as much as mind memory. We met our good Samaritans in Rutba, and our mission was accomplished. Almost 5 years later, I returned to Iraq with Christian peacemaker teams, joining the team in Suleimani, Iraqi Kurdistan last September and October. CPT works at the invitation of and in solidarity with local peace and human rights groups. Mohammed and Parveen are Iraqi Kurdish members from working closely with CPT as a part of the team there from Suli. Lukáš Furla from the Czech Republic is the CPT team leader, has been there 3 or 4 years already. Lukáš is in CPT because he heard Shane Claiborne tell the Rutba story in Germany in 2006 and went up to Shane and said, "That's my calling." And he's been in CPT since then and is now our team leader in Iraqi Kurdistan. 2 other members of our team and I participated in an interfaith press conference in a community gathering place called the Cultural Cafe in Suli. It was led by a woman who invited a Muslim, a Christian, an Yazidi, and others to speak. Their message was a plea and a promise, a pledge to work together for peace. We went to investigate a little village out, way out in the desert hills near an oil and gas drilling company because it was being harmed by the drilling. Oil tankers were destroying the roads, making this a long, slow ride. It was hours out there. It wasn't that far in distance, but the oil company closed the highway that went by the oil drilling place and made the villagers drive an extra hour around on very rough roads so that they wouldn't go by the drilling. The principal here of this little school in the village welcomed us there. We stopped at the school first. And then he showed us the school building, and the danger from the drilling is the earth shaking, damaging the buildings. And this was on the outside of the school, a large crack. The building was only 3 years old, but it was now cracked all the way down, and he's showing us inside the school, the jagged crack across the wall, which is in danger of falling down, but they're still using it. The oil company keeps promising to repair it, and of course, nothing ever happened. Part of our task is to be there to help them be a voice, to give voice to that and to follow up in other ways. This is looking down the hill at the oil company where the drilling was. In addition to destroying the road and damaging the buildings, drilling contaminates water and pollutes the air, making villagers sick. And they are unheard and unheeded. Bahar, a director of a Kurdish Women's Development Agency and the leader of a consortium of human rights groups in Kurdistan, a consortium called Jian, which means life, was a team leader there, and she asked CPT to go with them, to accompany them in investigating the women and girls who were abducted from this was, remember, in late September, and from August 2 on was when all the ISIS crisis was, and they had displaced thousands and thousands of Yazidis from Sinjar region and so on. We're in Duhok up in the northeastern. So Peggy and I went up on that trip with 18 others to document, talk to Yazidi people and document that in northeastern Kurdistan. The Duhok region and the city of Duhok is the capital of that region, and the first place we went is to talk with the mayor here, the governor of that region here in the center who welcomed us. Peggy's on this end here, and the 3 women are part of our group. The mayor's in the center, and this was after we had our meeting with them, and he expressed his gratitude and blessed our work. And then for the next several days, we set out to the different IDP camps, the internally displaced people, and talked to as many people as possible. This was Bajid up by the Syrian border, filled with Yazidis now. Our Xi'an group of 20 divided into teams of 4 to cover the camp and went from tent to tent, greeting whoever was there and asking if they knew anyone missing. And if they said no, then we said, thanks be to God, but alhamdulillah, something like that. Is that close? Yeah. Yeah. And then we'd go on to the next tent and talk to them. And then if they said yes, then we told them what we were doing and could we talk to them? Would they tell us? And usually we were invited in and we sat in the tent and took they had very careful documentation for all of that. Kashong is a young Kurdish student from Suli studying in the UK. She was home visiting for her family for 2 weeks and took the several days. She was so committed to doing this. I was very glad she was with us because she spoke English and was in my group, and so was my interpreter for that, for those days that we worked together. As a tremendous young woman. In and around the cities, another place there are Yazidis, in every abandoned building and so on. This 4-story is very typical of 4-story cement building that had just been partially built and now is filled with Yazidis who lived there. Children everywhere. I'll show you some pictures of children soon. And as we walked around in there, I was very, very conscious of, now having grandchildren and so on, and they're children of all age, from babies through teenagers. They're running all over. And so, for one, you have no privacy, no real restrooms, or any running water, anything. And you have all these children running up and down stairs in 4 floors, no walls, no stair railings or anything. I think of what would happen with my little grandchildren if they were running around in this place. But that's all they had. And this was an abandoned marketplace that was filled with Yazidis here. Kashong talked with an elderly man here right at that moment. I wasn't with her, and then she came back and told me the story that she talked with an elderly man who was curious and wondered who those 2 Americans were, Peggy and me. And so when she explained who we were with CPT and why we were there to accompany them, he wept with gratitude that someone in the world cared enough to be there and would be able to tell their story, that they would not be forgotten. One of the things that Yazidis feel like is they're hated by everyone and not known by anyone, or just dismissed or forgotten people. This Muslim woman on the left is one of my team members, and she was talking with this elderly Yazidi couple there. And then the other camp we went at, Kunki camp, is near the Mosul Dam, is the largest one. There are some 55,000 Yazidis across the hills, just tent after tent after tent. And so we divided up in these teams of 4 and would go up rows of tents and talk to everyone we could. This young woman there in the center and this one are sisters. She is 15 and she is 17. They were sort of the head of this little tent household. And when we asked them, they said, yes, they know missing people. When we sat down there, this was the last of the day and the longest and hardest time. They gave detailed information on 70 women from 2 years old to mid-70s who were missing from families they knew. We documented over 1,100 women and girls missing. And so now Jian Bahar and the group takes that information and continues to try to gain their release. Children, children, children everywhere were profoundly important. This little girl, for me, is the face of a war-weary child that should never have to face or go through what she is going through. And children following us and having lots of fun. It's amazing how much joy and playfulness and graciousness they have under their circumstances of having lost everything. These guys were with me quite a while one day and loved having their picture taken. Our first grandchild was born 5 years ago last Sunday. Grandchildren have renewed the fullness of love and life for me. I have been awakened to the deep deep interconnectedness of our children and grandchildren with all the children of the world. This is, on the left picture is our son Justin and Sarah, and then Olivia, who's 5, and Kellen, who's 20 months. And on the right is our daughter Tamara and Stefan, and Sebastian and Soren Rose are our 4 grandchildren. What I want to say, and what I've been saying now for some time, is that it's a lie to say that we love our children and grandchildren while we participate, even with silence, in harming other people's children and grandchildren around the world. It's a great, great lie, and it's a great sin. And it's one of the things we have to name and understand. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese poet, has much spiritual wisdom. In his book, In the World We Have, he calls us to live in a way that a future will be possible for our children and grandchildren. And he is not just talking about our personal children and grandchildren without paying attention to the other children and grandchildren of the world. As the Bible tells us, God's call upon heaven and earth to give witness to our choice. I have set before you life and death. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. And again, your descendants are not just your personal descendants. It's April 15, Tax Day in the United States. Do you know where your tax dollars go and how many tax dollars go for war? At Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke a truth to a country at war in Vietnam, declaring, a nation that continues to spend year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. If anything, that's more true today. A central truth of spiritual life is becoming aware of our own shadow. The personal and national spiritual death we face is our refusal to see our personal and national shadow. 2 names for our shadow are American exceptionalism and addiction to war. For most of Christian history, just war has been the operative paradigm, but it wasn't always that way. The first centuries of the Christian movement following Jesus meant not fighting war. Now, just war criteria are identified in various ways. A recent book by James Murphy, a Jesuit, is called War's Ends, Human Rights, International Order, and the Ethics of Peace. He argues for 6 criteria in the order I'll show you in a moment, and only addresses jus ad bellum to determine whether to wage war. And Murphy does this not, he's a Jesuit, a Catholic of course, he's doing it in the Catholic context. He does not draw on scripture or the social teachings of the church, but focuses on political philosophy. It's a very, very good book. I don't agree with it, of course, but it's a very, very good new, it's very new, it just came out last year. And so his 6 criteria: competent authority, just cause, right intention, reasonable success, last resort, proportionality. Which of those, well, let's just stay with that just a moment. Which of those were met to wage war in Iraq? That's a rhetorical question from now, but we could talk about that. And then the other criteria, jus in bello, is a criteria determining if the conduct of war is justified, especially in discrimination and proportionality and the immunity of the innocent. All are huge problems. The new one, the third one that gets very, very, very little attention and is incredibly important if you're going to work with this, is jus post bellum as a criteria for ending war and establishing peace. There is a little bit of new literature on that, but not much yet. I have long struggled with just war, and am intensely engaging it again. I am dissatisfied with much that is proposed as just war, and even more with how it is and isn't applied. I'm also dissatisfied with the paradigms of just war and pacifism. There are huge misunderstandings on how those are categorized. I no longer use the language of pacifism. Yes, I am pacifist. I want to be very clear about that. But I no longer use that language. My work at this point is what I am committed to nonviolent just peace. And I reached 3 conclusions before I get to just peace, 3 conclusions about just war and propose just peace as a better way. First, just war has done more to justify war than to evaluate and limit war. Just war is just war. Second, the war in Iraq was widely declared, probably more than any war that I know of, as failing to meet just war criteria ahead of time. More people opposed it, said it didn't meet just war criteria, and around the world, religious leaders, all kinds of people, than any other war we ever imagined. Nevertheless, war was waged. I think it is further testimony to the fallacy and failure of just war. And third, just war conversations, especially in the face of permanent war and the global war on terrorism and the other things that have gotten us there, are highly polarized. My observation is, and over the last years since the Iraq-Afghan wars and so on, and as I engage just war theorists and so on, my observation is that the just war community is forever split between the permissive and the restrictive just war proponents. And the permissive proponents hold a disingenuous American bias justifying our wars in ways they don't apply to others. Restrictive proponents are closer to realizing war is not just and closer to those of us who are pacifists than they are to permissive just war adherents. I found that over and over again. A prominent just war proponent today, a new one, getting lots of attention, moral theologian at Oxford, Nigel Biggert. His recent book, In Defense of War, is generating much conversation and justifies the Iraq War. In sharp contrast, a Catholic, David Carroll Cochran's Catholic Realism in the Abolition of War begins this way, and he's very, very clear, his first words. War's 2 great lies are its righteousness and its inevitability. It is neither. War is never permissible, never morally permissible, and while it is deeply rooted in human history, it is not an inescapable part of the human condition. Like other forms of institutionalized violence, once thought just and unavoidable, we can and should abolish it completely, leaving a world, yes, marked by conflict and violence, but nonetheless better off for war's absence. The World Council of Churches formed after World War II as an international ecumenical collaboration as a global Christian response, in part as a global Christian response to war, but as a way to work together. And they declared then, and have been struggling with this, in 1948, war is not the will of God. In the World Council of Churches for the last 15 years has been envisioning and working on a just peace as a paradigm shift from just war. I've been part of that movement. The founding visionary was a Mennonite, a friend, Fernando Lenz, is a Mennonite theologian from Germany, who's on the World Council General Council, and a big reason why there is a just peace. There was a convocation in May of 2011 in Kingston, Jamaica, that I was a part of with 1,000 people from all over the world who came together to spend a week sort of wrestling out a vision for just peace. Just peace has 4 arenas that are distinct yet interwoven in a comprehensive approach. Just peace in community. It begins at home, breaking cycles of violence, fostering conflict transformation, and building just peace in our homes and civic and faith communities. Now, obviously, I can only just identify these. Just peace with the earth is care for God's creation, the reform of lifestyles, and the pursuit of ecological justice encouraging eco-congregations and watershed discipleship as signs of hope and right living with all creation. Just peace in the marketplace, economies of life for sustainable production and consumption and meaningful work. And then the arena that gets to the one that we call war, where just war fits in, is just peace among peoples or across nations, but with the attention on peoples. That strengthen international human rights and humanitarian law, promote multilateral negotiation to resolve conflicts, reduce national military capacities, pardon me, and delegitimize the institution of war. Pardon me. I'm almost done. I'm working on a comparison of themes and tenets of just war and just peace, and paradoxes, as there will be. Here are some distinctions I see between just war and just peace that cry out for our attention. Just war privileges violence. Just peace privileges nonviolence. Just war attends to people with power, the ones who make the decisions. You could say this is the one in the just war side is very much the 99% and the 1%. 99% of the people pay, or the 1% are making the decisions and fighting it, and are the ones who decide we go to war. Just peace, it's power with the people. It attends to the people. Just war is driven by ideology. Just peace is driven by imagination. Just war is about waging war, and just peace is about waging peace. And here's maybe the most important one. Just war, no matter how you cut it, is still retributive justice. And just peace is restorative justice. So it's an enormous shift in paradigms. This is the one I like, I've been sort of playing with here. Just war is still about winning over others. That is, there's a winner and a loser. A war is fought, somebody comes out on top. But if you remember Jesus and Gandhi and King and everybody else who's worked with nonviolence is a very different way of talking about winning over others. It's about engaging the enemy and involving others in an entirely new way. Who pays and who profits is very, very different. Who pays in just war, or again, the 99% and who profits, is always, people get rich on war. It's one of the major reasons we have war. Almost a century ago, a Marine General Smedley Butler went on this, he wrote this essay and went, "War is a racket." This is in 1933. He spoke publicly across America. Showed war is how people make money. That's why we fight wars, so people get rich. This is not new stuff. And then in the language that we use in just peace is the paradigm shift is from national security to human security. So I leave you with a question and an image. The question is this: do you really believe that if we invested $4 trillion and all the people and resources that we devote to war instead to nonviolent just peace, that we would not have a better world in the future than we have now? Does anyone really believe that? The count that I have is that this we've already spent in the Iraq-Afghan wars is $4.4 trillion. We pay for that. And then when I was going to go through a whole litany of other costs and consequences that also need to be heard. The vision, the image I want to leave with you is a visionary nonviolent peace group, Pacifism, great group of people, claims this image. Nonviolent action, a ballet, not a battle. Choosing ballet or battle makes all the difference in the world, even whether there will be a world. I have other photos in the back. Carl is going to monitor the discussion time and has a handout of 2 articles. One I wrote from Amman when I was healing in the beginning of April 2003. I wrote it for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and then it got picked up by all kinds of other places. And the other one I wrote after our 2010 trip. This is the book. Greg Barrett helped get us back and wrote this book on our 2003-2010 trip, The Gospel of Rutba, War, Peace, and the Good Samaritan in Iraq. Very, very good book. Sammy's in this book, and it's our story. After 2003, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, that some of you know, with his connections to the Institute, wrote this to Baghdad. He was on our CPT team, Jonathan and Leah. A young couple had just been married a year and were finishing college and came and joined us in the middle of war. To Baghdad and Beyond, How I Got Born Again in Babylon. This one, I have extra copies. This is a copy. If somebody wants it for $10, I'd be glad to. I have other copies at home. This one is mine. And then one other thing, I just got this from the UK. We're 4 of us in Seattle, or the Seattle part of World Beyond War. And so this is a new shirt they put out of World Beyond War in various languages. So I just got this a couple days ago. And so that's, yeah. So anyway, what is stirring in your heart and mind? I welcome your comments and conversation. Yep. Is that on? Oh, thanks. Thank you.
We do invite your comments, questions. We have some time for discussion. And we do invite you to use any of the 3 microphones here. And the reason we're using the microphones, 1, so that we can hear each other, and 2, so that it feeds into the recording. I do have a few more handouts. We're going to ask those of you who are at the Collegeville Institute to not take a handout tonight, and we'll be sure to get one to you later. Does anybody else need a handout that's not at the Collegeville Institute?
Roger, back here. And Sammy can be part of this too if you want to. We have 2 Rockies here, so they can respond, but yeah.
Thank you for your talk, very inspiring. So there's so many crises from the Ukraine, Syria, different hotspots in Africa.
Yeah.
And so as a regular person here, what doorways or pathways can any of us walk through other than getting on a plane and doing what you did?
Well, there are, I would say, 2 things that are important to me at least. One is that I haven't done anything that all of you can't do. And we need all of you. The other is that there are many, many ways to pay attention and to engage a call to peacemaking. It takes all of us in all the ways that we're called. And I could not have gone without Marg and our church. By the way, I'll tell you a little story, but I didn't get to put this one in. When we got our visas in March 2003 and we're going into Baghdad, we were weren't sure we'd get him, and sort of back and forth, and so we were on the way. So I called her. It was evening for us in Amman and morning there, and she was at work already, and I called her. We had just gotten our visas, and I called her and said, "Happy anniversary, I'm going to Baghdad." It was our 36th anniversary. what I'm saying is it really takes all of us in all kinds of support. I couldn't have done it without a church. I couldn't have done it without a supportive family. There's just lots of ways. So engagement, there are also a lot of good peace organizations to really know about and be, certainly Catholic ones. I've worked a lot with all kinds of the Catholic Worker, Pax Christi, Pacifism, and so on. And they're very, very involved also. Lots of good Catholics in CPT. CPT.org, so that's one way. Just be involved or know what's happening. The other one that's very, very important is you have to get alternative news and stories. I've been a news junkie for all of my adult life, and I've worked very closely with the media a lot, have been in lots of radio and TV interviews and newspaper and so on over the years in different places. I am more disappointed and discouraged about any of the normal news media. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post are both incredibly biased. There is incredibly biased toward American patriotic views. You cannot get news or know the world by paying attention to our newspaper. You've got to look, and there are, with the internet, there are so many. Right now, I pay a lot of attention to consortium news as well as a lot of the peace groups and their own work. I get word through CPT every day from Palestine and Colombia and Iraq and Canada and so on. So it's looking for other sources, looking for the people who are writing something differently. There's an incredible wealth of information out there for us to be part of. So be a part of it however you can find to do that. Several years ago, I talked to the American Benedictine Academy and told some of these stories. My encouragement was that every monastery, men and women, send at least one monk to CPT every year. It will change them and it will change you. Thank you, Greg. Anyone else? And Sammy's here too, yes.
Well, I am not able to spend so much time following all the news, but I do try to follow the news. What keeps coming to my mind, I lived in Europe for 5 years, beginning 12 years after the Second World War, and Europe would not be what it is now without the Marshall Plan, the massive aid,
Yes.
what you call their restorative justice. The United States, instead of leaving Europe with reparations, as they had done after the First World War, punitive reparations, it took on the reparations itself, the United States. And it seems to me that that lesson was not applied or learned with the Middle East and Iraq.
Yeah.
It was decimated and destroyed with our weapons and with our responsibility. But the United States is not taking responsibility to restore and repair that massive damage.
That's right. I think the U.S. can help in a lot of ways. I think the two things that would matter in the world with the kind of aid we did, one, if a lot of the military aid was changed to other forms of economic humanitarian aid. The other is, and a very, very important one, is that to ask the people whom you're helping what it is they need and how we can help. And to not tie it to American political policy. There's a reason we're the world's largest arms trader, and most of the weapons of the world come from this country. So there's a lot of change we need in that. Anyone else? Others of you have been, Steve. have been in Iraq. And
I just wanted to mention in that vein of the last question, in 2012, we were able to travel back to Najaf, our sister city, and at the recommendation of Sami Razuli, our host, one of the things that our delegation did was pick up trash in the street as a symbolic action for all of the destruction that Americans had caused, that we were just trying to symbolically show that we bear responsibility for helping the cleanup. And then a day or two later, we planted trees with a group of young people in Najaf along the Boulevard Street. And again, for me, the symbolic action of planting trees and trying to restore the natural environment, as well as working for healing with people, are very important symbolic actions. And the reason we did those actions, and they were very short demonstrations, but for us, it's also communicating a sense of hope, a sense of relationship between American people and the Iraqis. And so that's a type of peacemaking that a lot of us can be involved in, just as gestures of goodwill, and then waiting for a response, and then beginning the dialogue.
the more we can do people to people, the more things will change and recognize who we are with each other in the world, and why it matters that we care for each other. Well, Sammy, yeah. Please.
Thank you, Weldon, for the beautiful stories, including me and the events that you witnessed in 2010. I would like to respond to the question before the last, who pays and who profits? Of course, we pay today, on April 15, the taxpayers, the American people are paying for the wars. According to the Swedish organization called Stockholm International Peace Research Institute,
Yes, right.
recently just sent us a report saying sales arms in 2012 and 2013 went down by 1.9%, and that's equivalent to $1.75 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. The combined sales of the armed sales, of course, to profit and by the people who engage in the war, leading by the U.S., was $420 trillion. The top 100 companies who sells arms in 2012 and 2013, 59 of them are Americans.
Or what?
Led by Americans, companies, led by Lockheed Martin
Yeah, right.
and Boeing. So who is the customer of those companies? The only customer who afford to buy, for example, a F-35 jet fighters,
Yeah.
that is still not designed, but will be designed in 2018 and sold to the U.S. government in 2020, cost $100 million. The only party who's affording to pay this is the American government. So the American governments, by the corporations, representatives, the lobbyists who wage wars, are making the arms, and the American government paying, using the taxpayers, and paying for these arms to use them in the wars. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I'll be around yet if somebody wants to talk, but thank you very much for being here.